think my goal today in this first session, I'll maybe move a bit quickly because we're a little bit behind time, and I want us to spend as much time as we can on the practical exercise more than have you sit and listen to me. I want us to start doing group exercises together. I'm going to present something called Create, and basically it's a framework for that important first step that Gonzalo mentioned of doing vulnerability assessment for climate change. So finding out where the vulnerability of the community is and what capacity they have to be able to respond. I'm going to present it like a framework, so I won't talk very much about our own experiences, but I want to give some sort of take-home lessons that you can maybe take and apply in your own countries, in your own contexts. And we're going to focus on two parts in particular, which is what we call internal sensitivity and external exposure. And what I'll present you is what we'll use for the group exercise this morning. So maybe I'll go quite quickly now, and we'll have a chance to talk about it in the group exercise later. So just to introduce SDF a little bit, Sustainable Development Foundation, where I work. Basically a small Thai NGO, so I think probably quite similar to a lot of the participants who've come today. We only have 19 full-time staff, almost all of which are Thai. There are only two foreign staff, so I spend most of my days speaking Thai, so my English is getting a bit rusty now. We were founded in 1996, formally registered in 2000, and basically the issues we work on is how communities and the environment interact together. So we initially started doing natural resource management work in all sorts of different areas, from hill tribes in the north of Thailand to sea gypsies in the south. But then after the tsunami happened in 2004, our work became more focused on coastal areas and small-scale fishing communities, and we started to move into disaster risk reduction. At that time, we were the Secretariat organisation for something called the Save Andaman Network, which was a coalition of NGOs, government organisations, working together to do relief and rehabilitation, and we worked all together in 121 communities over a period of about 3 or 4 years. And after that, we had lessons related to disaster risk management, and we were invited to take those lessons from coastal areas and apply them elsewhere in Thailand. So we worked in another 26 different areas, and then eventually the disaster risk reduction work moved into climate change. So we've had a gradual transition from NRM to DRR and then to CCA, climate change adaptation. And at the moment we're involved in 2 large projects, one managed by UNDP and the other managed by IUCN. And you can see some of the partners that we work with there. And apart from my role with SDF, I'm also a member of something called the Thai Working Group for Climate Justice. So it's an NGO group that looks at social justice issues related to climate change. And I'm also the coordinating body in Thailand for something called GNDR, the Global Network of Civil Society Organisations for Disaster Reduction. So that's just a little bit about me and the organisation, so you know where we're looking for. I think this bit we've covered now. I wasn't sure whether it would be introductions, but I think we've covered that. So maybe I can just ask for a show of hands. We talked about CBA now, but if anybody's done vulnerability assessment for climate change, can you raise your hand? Okay, so not too many people. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about Create. We had to give it a name. We didn't really want to give it a name because what we were trying to do is not to create another toolkit. Because as a local NGO, when we looked at vulnerability assessment, we found there were so many toolkits from all over the world. It was really confusing. Why are they different? So we've given it a name, but we're trying not to make it a toolkit. But what we tried to do is we tried to look at what is vulnerability assessment. What are the core things that you have to do? So we looked at the CARE CDCA model. We looked at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies, UNDP, UNEP, IUCN, Crystal. We looked at them all. And we tried to say, okay, what are they all saying? What's the really simple things that we need to be doing at the field level, at the local level? And what we find is there are 4 main things that you need. You need a conceptual framework so that you know what you're talking about, you know what issues you need to investigate. You need an overall process, you need some steps that you're going to carry out in the field with the community. You need some tools and methods. We don't want to give too many tools because we think people are intelligent. People can think of their own tools. We all have a lot of tools that we use in working every day anyway. But we need some, because what we find is if we don't give people any tools, sometimes they don't know what to do and they get a bit stuck. And then finally, we say it's good if you have a reporting format. If you know how to report vulnerability, then you can compare results between communities or different countries. And today we're going to focus mostly on the conceptual framework because we don't have a lot of time. So we'll focus on the conceptual framework and we'll use that for the exercise, the vulnerability exercise that we'll do. But just to say, in the materials that will be available electronically after the Congress is finished, there's a leaflet in PDF format about Create, which has some more details. So if you want to know more, you'll be able to find out more after the conference. So looking at the conceptual framework, basically this is one of the most important parts of the presentation, I think, for today that I want us to focus on. We're looking at two things, vulnerability and capacity. And for our group work today, we'll focus on vulnerability, which is the negative side. But if you were doing it for real, you'd also look at capacity, what capacity you have to adapt. And what we say is that both sides, they have internal things and external things. The internal things are things that maybe we can control, maybe we have some influence over. And the external things, they come from outside and we can't control those too much. For vulnerability, we say the internal things are sensitivity, what makes us sensitive to change. And the external things, we call them exposure, what things are we going to be exposed to in the future. And then we have a similar breakdown for capacity. So this is going into a little bit more detail on the vulnerability side. So basically what we say is, if you want to look at why a community is vulnerable, you need to be looking at three areas that they can manage. One is livelihoods, one is natural resources and ecosystems, how they're managing those things. And the other one relates to things like land use, infrastructure, and utilities. So these are three things that are kind of within the ecosystem or within the community that they can manage. And then the things that are coming from outside might be threats or cause change to come about are climate factors, but also non-climate factors. We find that you have to consider both. And again, we can break these down into a little bit more detail to give some more clarity. And later on for the group exercise, we'll have a handout and we'll get to work on some of these things in more detail. So I won't go through them all, but basically when I talk about way of life, livelihood, what we're talking about. So we have livelihood, but we also have things like debt, security, diversity, social groups, economic activity. And when I talk about land use and infrastructure, we have things like, do people have access to water and electricity? What's transportation and communication like in the community? And then for the exposure part, the things that are coming from outside, we have the climate factors. And in working with communities, we make it really easy. We say, it's basically things you know about anyway. What's happening with the temperature and the seasons? What's happening in terms of the rainfall, wind, what's happening in the sea? And we talk about extreme weather events and natural disasters. So we don't get caught up in really complicated things like climate change models and whatever, but we just talk about really simple things. But then we also get people to look at non-climate factors that are changing from outside. So things like policy and law, for example. We're working with one community in Canterbury province that lives in a mangrove forest. And basically everything they do is illegal. The law says they're not allowed to live there, they're not allowed to make use of timber, they're not allowed to fish. So basically they have a lot of threats coming from the policy and legal framework we have. And then, just very quickly, because today we'll focus on the vulnerability, but you can do the same thing with capacity. You can break it down into internal things and external things. And you'll notice the external things are the same. They're the climate factors and the non-climate factors. But you can look at them both positively and negatively. So they're not just a threat, sometimes they're an opportunity. But the internal side, we can break it down into, it's just a standard breakdown. If anybody's ever done SWOT analysis, so you have capabilities, which is, do you have knowledge and information? Do you have the skill and capacity to be able to work? You have resources, which obviously includes money, but it includes other things like, do you have individuals or groups set up that are going to be responsible for the work? And then you have different mechanisms like policies and plans, and whether you have networking and collaboration with other organizations. And again, like I say, the climate factors and non-climate factors are the same ones that we use when we're assessing vulnerability. So that gives us a broad overview of what vulnerability and capacity are, and we'll get to work on those and think about those more in the group exercise, so I'll go quite quickly. The other thing we try to do with the conceptual framework is we try to say, okay, what are we trying to do? What is climate change adaptation? What's the goal? And what we do is we compare two things. We compare coping capacity and adaptive capacity. So what we say is coping capacity is about, it's kind of like disaster risk reduction, if anybody's ever worked on that. It's about stabilizing a situation that's in crisis. It's about rehabilitating communities to get rid of the problems they have and get them back to their normal state. And it's about protecting them from future risk. But when we look at adaptation, we need to go further than that. And we need to increase levels of security, whether it's food security, livelihood security, income. We need to develop options within the community, so raise their level of income, raise their quality of life, so that if they do receive a shock from climate change in the future, they'll be in a stronger position. And then in some cases we need to adapt, we need to bring about changes, because maybe whatever we do there, current existing livelihood is maybe going to become threatened. Can I cut to the photographs quickly? I have some photographs that I want to quickly show you. So, this set is basically a set of photographs which are all kind of what we would talk about in terms of coping capacity. So, basically they're all responding to events once they've already happened. Things like search and rescue, providing relief supplies. All of these things, they might help people to get past an individual event, but they don't really make people any safer or better off in the long term. So these things are important and you need to do them, but they're what we call coping strategies. You're only coping with the existing situation. Things like looking at hazard maps where the safe and dangerous areas are. Okay, maybe you know which parts of the community are safe, which parts are dangerous, but you haven't made the dangerous areas any less dangerous. They're still just as dangerous as they were before. You've just identified where they are. So we tend to refer to these things as coping strategies, and like warning towers. You haven't reduced the opportunity of a tsunami or a flood happening. You've just given somebody a warning when it is going to happen. So I want to contrast these things that we call coping strategies with what we would call more adaptive strategies, and I'll give you a few examples. So most of these examples aren't related to the coast, but they are related to how communities and the environment interact. These first few are related to forest fire in Thailand. Thailand's a very humid country. Forest fire is virtually impossible to happen naturally. So 99.9% of forest fires in Thailand are caused by human activity, mostly agricultural burning. So if you want to reduce risk and reduce vulnerability, you need to change people's agricultural practices. It's not a natural disaster. This next one is a very good one. What you can see on the top that looks like a road is actually a dike. It's a wall that was built to capture water for agriculture to prevent drought. The community on the right-hand side is very badly affected by drought, so they built this dike to keep water on the right-hand side. What they forgot was that on the left-hand side, in the rainy season, it receives a lot of water. And so by solving the problem of drought on the right-hand side, they flooded the community on the left-hand side in 3 meters of water for 3 months a year. If you ask, is this a natural disaster? It has to do with a lot of rainfall, yes. But if you didn't build the dike, then you wouldn't have the disaster. So when we're looking at climate change, we need to think about, as I mentioned, we need to think about natural resource management, we need to think about land use planning and infrastructure. This is a concrete example. You can see in the end the farmers came out with their tools and started to cut it away until eventually the local authorities bought a mechanical digger. And if you look, the level of water goes down instantly. In the first photograph, the level of water was as high as the road. As soon as you cut away the dike, the water is released. Another example here, this is a hillside in Nan province in northern Thailand. And what I want you to look at is the hill in the background. Is a pristine forest. No forest has been cut down yet, looking really healthy. The hill in the foreground is another photograph from further away. Is bald, no trees left now. The only trees is a fruit plantation, I think it's long gone. So they've taken all the forest away on a steep hillside, and they've cut the road in as well. And you can see as soon as they do those two things, what happens? You get a landslide. So again, showing that things like land use planning and how you manage your natural resources, they're making communities more vulnerable. if that community was living in pristine forest, they probably wouldn't be affected by a landslide. But when you change the forest to fruit plantation and you put a road in, it causes the land to slide. Another example of a community in northeastern Thailand, and what I want you to look at here is what you can see down the middle there. It looks like a stream. It's actually bedrock. So this community lives on an area that has solid rock underneath them, and yet they're planting. I think they're planting corn. You can see the level of soil is only about 6 to 8 inches. Every year they receive heavy rainfall and the soil becomes eroded. Within maybe 3-4 years, there'll be no soil left. So that livelihood that they're using in that particular ecosystem is completely inappropriate. So again, it's that mixture of livelihoods and natural resources. This is an example related to infrastructure and bad infrastructure planning. You can see that obviously there's been a flash flood, and what you can see along here is what should be the main water channel. But when they build this water gate to control the water gate, the water can't get past, and it floods the houses on the left-hand side. So what it shows you is that in doing their land use and infrastructure planning, they made a lot of mistakes. They put houses right against the canalway, and then they put a small water gate in a canalway that can't receive the volume of water. And this is a similar example. A house built on a bend in a stream, and again they put a small water gate in, and when the flash flood comes, the water can't get past, floods the house, and that house is completely destroyed. And another example from a place called Uttaradit province in central Thailand. In Thailand, we like to build very cheap bridges. So we just take a big piece of concrete and put it across the banks of the river so that the cars can drive across. But then as soon as you get a flash flood or a mudslide, it takes the bridge away. Because the bridge is just one piece of concrete. Like in the UK where I live, if it was an area where you knew there was a lot of water, your bridge would be an arch so that the water could pass through. But to make it cheaper, they build a flat bridge, and as soon as the landslide or the flash flood comes, it takes the bridge away. So these are just some examples to show you that we need to think about how livelihoods, natural resource management, and land use and infrastructure all interact together. Can I go back to the presentation, please? And overall, the journey that we need to take for climate change adaptation, we need to reduce existing sensitivity first. So those internal factors that we have some control over, we need to manage those and make ourselves less sensitive to the change outside. And then we need to look at exposure, we need to look at the threats that are coming from outside, both now and in the future. If you have a lot of threats in the present, it's pointless thinking about climate change 10 years in advance. And then finally, if we can do both of those things, we try to increase flexibility, diversity, and resilience. So climate change is always a gamble. Even if you have really good climate projections, you can never predict the future. So if we can increase flexibility and diversity, we're increasing the community's chance of survival and having a better quality of life. So now I just want to very quickly touch on the other areas. So we focused on the conceptual framework. I'll just very quickly go through some of these other areas just to give you an overall view of what we're trying to do. So we have a 10-step process that we carry out. First 2 steps are related to capacity building. So we try and create an understanding with the local communities of what is climate change adaptation. And then we do some capacity building on information gathering, because to learn about vulnerability, you need to, it's almost like doing statistical analysis. So we need to have communities understand that within their community, not everybody is the same. For example, if it's a fisherfolk community, some people are rich fisherfolk, they have very big boats, they have lots of money to invest. Other people are very poor, maybe they have one set of nets. If they lose their nets, they have to borrow money to buy another set, and they're in debt. So not everybody within the community has the same vulnerability. So we do some training about how they can look at the different socio-economic groups within the community. Then we do some work on vulnerability, so we gather information and we do some analysis. And then when we do that, we know where the problems are, basically. When we've analysed the vulnerability, we know where the problems are coming from within the community. So we do some scenario building. We say, okay, these problems, if you don't fix them, if you leave these problems as they are, and then climate change comes along, what's going to happen? in 10 years, in 20 years' time, and we get them to come up with some scenarios. And that allows us to define some goals. Okay, what are we going to do? Now we know what might happen in 10 or 20 years. What are the activities that we want to do? And only then, once we have some activities, do we go on to looking at stakeholders and capacity to be able to do those activities. We found a lot of vulnerability methodologies. They try and analyze capacity without defining any goals yet. And the question is, well, capacity for what? Capacity to adapt to climate change? That's huge. So we think you have to have some specific goals first before you can adapt. So for example, you might know that the community where you're working is very dependent on one particular species of crab. And you need to improve the chance of that crab to survive against climate change. That gives you a specific goal, then you can do some capacity analysis. For the tools and methods, the one important thing I want to say is that if we look at all of the different VCA methodologies, most of the tools are just standard tools that we use in working with communities. So there aren't that many different tools really. But the one tool that we find is a specific tool and it's really useful. It's the one that we're going to look at this morning. It's called the vulnerability matrix. So some of you may have seen it already. We're going to use